Howdy peeps, and welcome to 2024. The first video of the year. Now, in between my last video to now, I had some time to refresh and just enjoy the holidays. But most importantly, to this video, it gave me a chance to look through What If Season 2. Now first, I actually really enjoyed the first season of What If. Yeah, it wasn't perfect, there were plenty of flaws, like the not so creative subject matters, the animation and the pacing, but overall, I enjoyed the zombie, evil Doctor Strange, and especially the Ultrons episode. With that Ultron one being one of my absolute favourite things to come out of any MCU show. So, when I saw What If was not only getting a second season, but a third season, I was definitely interested. Alongside the fact that a new episode would be released daily instead of weekly, definitely helped to keep my attention. However, after watching all of Season 2...
What the hell was that?
Yup, it was pretty bad. The pacing issues are even more obvious, the animation once again just doesn't look appealing, and the ideas behind the episodes just sucked. The only episode I would consider good was the first one. I actually really enjoyed Nebula's story, having a unique idea of almost a Blade Runner sort of setting, and Nebula was a fun character to watch, seeing a former villain trying to make the most of their second chance. But outside of that, it all goes downhill pretty much really fast. But instead of going over each episode one by one, and repeating myself the same issues over and over again, I instead want to take one thing about this show that is the prime example of everything wrong with the series. The one thing that perfectly encompasses all the problems this show has, and that thing is not actually a thing, but a character. Peggy Carter. Now wait, before you go to the comments to tell me how sexist I am, please just hear me out on this. Because after watching Season 2, especially the finale, I have come to realise that everything Peggy represents is a problem. Let's start with the first issue I have, being why Peggy at all? Why not any other character in this show? Why specifically Peggy? This has been a question I have had since Season 1, honestly, and for a long time I've been unable to really explain it, but now I'm pretty sure I can give a good go at explaining why. So I ask you, if What If's supposed to be the show that takes the big risks by drastically changing stories to tell a new one, then what's the point of Peggy being the super soldier? What exactly makes this story different from the original one beyond the surface level? That's the thing, it really isn't. Peggy's story is just Steve's story from the MCU. She becomes a super soldier, she stops Hydra, she becomes a person from the 30s in modern day, and even with Steve in this world, he's essentially just a Winter Soldier again, just with a old Iron Man suit instead. So what's the point? My biggest issue with Peggy is that she does not justify her own existence. Why have Peggy be the super soldier if only the surface level things change? Like the fact that Captain America is now a woman or the Winter Soldier is now Steve Rogers. On the surface level, it seems like a lot has changed, but in actuality, it's just the same story only with pointless changes that do not contribute or change the story in any meaningful way. You know, the whole reason we watch this show, to completely change the story, is just completely ruined. Peggy represents the series' unoriginality, you could say. They take recognisable characters from the MCU, only change the surface level things, and suddenly they say it's unique. Like, did anyone truly want a episode where Thor is some party dude, or where Happy becomes a Hulk, or when the same story is told again just with a different look? Now, I'm not saying that the show has to go too far from what we already know, But they've already shown that they can surprise us with some good ideas, like the Killmonger episode, or the Ultron episode, or the Doctor Strange episode. They took what we already knew from the MCU, and even the same stories, but introduced new elements that flips the story on its head completely. And suddenly, not only do you have something new, you also have something engaging. But for some reason they want to change only the most minor of things and say it's now new, apparently. Or they'll even do the other extreme and go too far with something new. Take Kahhori's episode. This episode is fundamentally bad as a what if episode. You might be wondering, how, if it's new and an actual good episode? Well, I ask you this. Did this need to be a what if episode? Not really. You could have taken this exact same story and put it in its own series or movie and nothing changes. It entirely defeats the purpose of what if by telling a completely new story that no longer fits within the context of what if. It's not a reimagining of a story we've already know, or even a story that takes elements from the MCU to create something original like the zombie episode. It's just its own thing, and thus feels really jarring compared to everything else, which are, in one way or another, mostly retellings. It essentially takes the what if out of what if, because there's nothing to change, it's something completely new and different. Which in any other show would be good, but in the context of what if, is not. It kinda just feels like someone threw in their OC into a show that already exists, because it doesn't gel well or go together with what's already been established. It's just something suddenly thrown in without making sense to be there. But back to Peggy. Not only does she represent the series' lack of originality, but she also represents the wrong mentality behind the show. The entire point of this show was to be an anthology, to have separate contained stories that would exist in their own worlds. Like you were reading different stories every week. It made sense and it worked. But Season 2 completely breaks this anthology idea, with weird endings teasing crossovers of all the stories. Now, this isn't exactly the worst thing in the world. After all, Season 1 did the same thing, but it did that okay. But here it becomes hugely problematic, because not only do they try to tease a crossover, but they do it so poorly to the point where I feel like I've wasted my time watching it. Instead of telling a new story, they try to continue the Peggy Carter story, which was already stale and unoriginal in its own right, and they continue into a pretty forgettable and bland sequel episode, to then end in a cliffhanger, and this cliffhanger was handled awfully. As when we see where this continues, we're suddenly thrown into Peggy suddenly being in medieval England with a story that feels like we missed a huge chapter that was being set up. The show acts like we're supposed to care, like this is some big betrayal by Thor, but doesn't show us anything to validate this payoff. Once again, showing the pacing issues and making me feel like I've wasted my time waiting to see a cliffhanger that just is never properly handled or paid off. And it's getting to a point where it's being so bad with these cliffhangers that half the show is setups for what's coming next instead of being an anthology show, which was one of the driving forces behind the first season. And that brings me to a major problem with this show. It's trying to be bigger than it actually is. The creators are trying to have a large-scale story with major consequences and stakes, yet do not understand the format they're working in. They're working within a show that has to be 30 minutes long an episode with 8 episodes a season. In average, that's 240 minutes a season. Only a third of that actually went into having a large story, roughly 80 minutes. Alongside having to cram in several other anthology stories in between. You see the problem? They're too ambitious, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, but it just fundamentally doesn't work. You can't have a huge climax where all your characters fight together if those characters are from separate stories each. Again, they're trying to be bigger than they really are, just like with Peggy Carter, a nothing character who they're forcing into being something more interesting and important than she actually is. She's the one in the center of everything. They want her to be their own Steve Rogers by copying the MCU's homework word for word, but only changing the most minor of things to try and look different. And before you say, I do not hate Peggy Carter. As a character, she is fine, but my point is, she's really not as interesting or unique as the creators are trying to tell us. They're forcing a character to fill a large role that they just don't fit. And to me, she's the perfect representation at everything wrong with What If, and what's ruining the genius concept. Like, I have no idea what Marvel's plan was with this show. If they wanted an anthology show that allows you to experiment with different ideas, then just stick to that. You were doing that already in season 1, and you were doing it pretty well. Stop trying to force things that don't work, stop trying to reuse the same uninspired stories, stop trying to force your show into being something it just isn't. And, in conclusion, I don't know what Marvel is gonna do, as they've already have a season 3 to release later this year, I believe, and seeing how bad this season was, I do not have high hopes for it. It's so disappointing that they have a wealth of characters and ideas that I, for one, would love to see adapted, that the fans would like to see adapted, such as what if the other half of Heroes got snapped away? What if Quill joined the Ego in Guardians 2? What if Hulk landed in nowhere instead of Sakaar? These are all interesting ideas I thought of off the top of my head, and the community have thought of off the top of their heads. But Marvel instead would rather have just another Captain America story, or another Party Bro story, or another big climax forced in story. I don't understand, and I hope Marvel learn their lesson soon, because I do not want this great a concept to go to waste, especially considering that they've already shown they're capable of doing stuff that's really good. But those are just my thoughts. What did you guys think of season 2? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know in the comments. Happy 2024 everyone, and I will see you all next time.